Somewhere in South Australia, a small town holds a mystery in the palm of its hand. The disappearance of a young woman in October 2016 would turn the community upside down and leave residents and local police questioning what happened to the Watervale Runner. There is no denying that Australia is as stunningly beautiful as it is unique. From its weird and wonderful wildlife to its rich and diverse landscapes, unlike those of any other nation, the land down under truly is one of a kind. And yet such a huge landmass has such a relatively small population. The country's interior, known as the Outback, is a boiling, inhospitable desert, and so more than 24 million people live their lives around the outskirts in more forgiving climates, which range from tropical to temperate. Many towns and cities are vast distances apart, divided across just 6 states. A truly fascinating place, Australia is also a bit of an enigma, much like the following tale, which comes to us courtesy of 26-year-old Jenny Roth. The story takes place in Watervale, a small town situated in the Clare Valley of South Australia, a region famous for its vineyards and wine distilleries. With a climate not too dissimilar to Northern California, the lush green valleys and quiet country roads seem like the last place you would expect to hear of any sinister happenings. But as we shall see, looks can be deceiving. What follows is a tale that defies belief and sends an ominous chill up the spine, and it all began on the evening of the 29th of September 2016. Jenny had not lived in the area long, just a couple of months. She had moved from Adelaide with her girlfriend Abigail to be close to her partner's terminally ill father, and being a city girl since the day of her birth, the quietness of the countryside had been something of a shock to the system. The nights were dark, darker than anything she had ever known, and life away from the hustle and bustle of a big city was not only an inconvenience, but also terribly boring. There were upsides to this relative isolation, however. The air was fresh and clean, the landscapes were beautiful, and there seemed to be a quiet harmony, a peacefulness to everything. She had grinned from ear to ear the first time she had heard the chorus of crickets after sunset. The people were much friendlier too. She and Abigail had only been living there for a few days before the neighbours arrived on the doorstep to say hello and welcome them to the small town. She had struck up something of a friendship with Marie from next door, and they would often catch each other for a chat whenever Jenny went outside for a smoke. Marie, being the outdoorsy type, was nearly always pottering around in the garden, weeding or digging or cutting the lawn. On this particular evening, Jenny stepped out onto the front porch for her customary post-dinner cigarette, to find her neighbour getting ready to go for her customary evening run. They spoke casually for a few minutes, and as always, Marie invited Jenny to go along with her. As always, Jenny politely declined. It wasn't that she was averse to running as such, but as it was just after 6 p.m. in late September, the sun would be setting in little over an hour, and she already found the darkness and remoteness of the countryside unnerving as it was. "Suit yourself," said Marie. "See you later." And with that, she hopped off her porch and jogged away. Jenny lit her cigarette and inhaled deeply as she watched her neighbour leave. She knew where Marie would be heading. Her route usually took her outside the small town of Watervale, along miles of dusty country roads, surrounded by open fields, speckled with thickets of trees and small woodlands. Beyond all that loomed a massive expanse of grassland and untamed bush, with only a few pockets of civilization dotting the landscape, as wide open and stunning as it was intimidating. Jenny could well appreciate why Marie insisted upon her evening runs, and wondered briefly whether she could ever get used to living in a place like this. It was a nice change from what she and Abigail were used to, but something about this town made her feel exposed, both mentally and physically. In the end, she decided no. Besides anything else, there wasn't enough in this small town to keep her occupied. Watervale was just one of those places where nothing ever happened. And with that thought still echoing somewhere in the recesses of her mind, she stubbed out the butt of her cigarette and headed indoors, completely unaware of just how wrong she would be. The morning of the 30th of September started out bright and clear, and Jenny was pulling freshly laundered clothes out of the washing machine, ready to hang out on the line in the backyard. She grabbed her cup of coffee, along with the laundry basket, and exited the house through the side door, and was surprised to see Marie sitting outside on the lawn, stock still and staring at the ground. It was rare for her neighbour to be up so early, and it was even more unusual to see her sitting doing nothing in particular. She was usually always attending to some chore or another. Nevertheless, Jenny called out a greeting, but Marie appeared not to have heard her. She called again, and this time her friend stirred and shook her head, as if she had just been pulled from some deep trance. Marie apologised, saying she must have been miles away, but this was all she said, before she slipped back into her reverie. Any attempts at idle chit-chat turned out to be in vain, as Jenny quickly realised that her friend was far too preoccupied for conversation. So instead, she proceeded to hang out her washing, but every now and then, she glanced over the fence at Marie, who continued to sit there in silence, frowning at the ground. Something was indeed troubling her. Before heading indoors, Jenny stopped and considered her neighbour for a moment, then asked if everything was okay. "I'm fine," came the reply, but the thickness of Marie's voice as she spoke suggested otherwise. Needless to say, Jenny was not convinced, and decided to push the boundaries of their newly formed friendship by probing what was on her mind. It took a little persuasion, but after a minute or two of gentle encouragement, Marie's shoulders finally drooped in resignation, and she let out a soft but audible sigh. "You won't believe me, but then Roger didn't either, so what the hell?" Somewhat apprehensively, she began to relate what happened the night before. She told Jenny that whilst on her run the previous evening, she had been out a couple of miles west of Spring Gully, as the sun was just touching upon the horizon, when she looked out across a wide open field to see three objects hovering close to the ground, about 300 metres away from where she was. She had stopped dead, mouth agape, just watching as they floated, still and silent. They stayed there for about 2 or 3 minutes, before moving off slowly, disappearing over the tree line at the other side of the field. Marie went on to say that they were not like any aircraft she had ever seen before. They were each about 50 feet wide, metallic and circular in shape, and they didn't make any sound whatsoever, even as they moved. Even though she expressed that she didn't believe in aliens, she firmly believed that what she saw was not of this world. There was just something unnatural and ominous about the way they behaved, which had deeply affected her. Jenny did not doubt her friend's story. Not only was she open-minded about the possibility of aliens and UFOs, having seen some strange things as a child, Marie had seemed sincere and genuinely disturbed by her experience. As a result, she held off running for a while afterwards, and it would be a couple of weeks before she worked up the courage to head back out that way. But gradually, things did return to normal. Marie's husband, Roger, on the other hand, didn't believe her, but that mattered little to her. Their relationship was strong enough for them to be open and honest with one another, and in any case, she didn't need other people to believe her. She knew what she had seen, Her only hope was that she would never see them again, and for a while at least, that much was true. Then, at around 9:30 p.m, on the 21st of October, Jenny and Abigail were sat on the sofa watching TV when they heard a knock at the door. It was Marie. She was bent forwards and gasping for air. Her husband Roger was stood behind her, with a disapproving look on his face, and when Jenny asked them what was wrong, he apologised for bothering them so late, and then said in a rather dismissive tone that his wife had been hallucinating again. Breathlessly, Marie told him to shut up, then turned to Jenny and said, "They were there again." It seemed the objects had returned. According to Marie, she had been running next to the same field where she had seen them the first time, when they suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Quite literally, one minute there was nothing there, the next, a movement in the periphery of her vision made her look to her right, and that's when she saw them again, hovering low to the ground over the field and moving slowly towards her. Again she stopped dead in her tracks, and was at first too stunned to move, but eventually panic got the better of her, and she ran to a nearby thicket of trees, dived into the brush and ducked out of sight. The objects continued to move in her direction, but as they reached the trees, they passed directly over her head and disappeared from view. She waited for at least an hour before leaving the small wood. Once she was sure the coast was clear, she ran, and she didn't stop running until she reached the front door of her house, doubled over in agony and completely out of breath. At first, Roger had been concerned, but as soon as Marie had mentioned the UFOs, he had scoffed. They had gotten into an argument over his refusal to believe her, an argument which was now continuing on Jenny and Abigail's porch, much to the couple's embarrassment. They didn't know whether to intervene or let the two of them have it out right there on their doorstep. Maybe it was just the adrenaline, but Jenny noticed that Marie didn't appear at all frightened by this second encounter, even though it was easily more disturbing than the first. If anything, she seemed emboldened by it and declared that she was going back there the next evening. She challenged her husband to join her, which he wholeheartedly rejected, saying he was not prepared to indulge this nonsense any further, and refused to entertain the idea of UFOs. With that, he apologised to his neighbours once more, then walked off the porch and went back indoors. Instead, Jenny offered to go along with Marie the next evening, whilst Abigail, who was pushing her mid-50s and didn't relish the idea of a run, declined, chuckling to herself as no doubt Roger had, at the prospect of space invaders. And so, on the evening of the 22nd of October, Jenny left Abigail at home and headed out with her neighbour up to the field where she had seen the strange objects. It was about 8 miles out of town, and Marie had brought her phone along in the hopes of taking some pictures, but it was all to no avail. The UFOs did not appear. They did not appear the evening after either, or the evening after that, and after 5 days, Jenny, who had gone with Marie every night since, decided to throw in the towel. Although she believed her neighbour was telling the truth about what she had seen, her girlfriend was beginning to feel a little neglected and had asked her to stop spending so much time with their neighbour. Marie understood, of course, but was determined to prove her husband wrong and continued to run out to the field every night afterwards. It was a course of action that would end in tragedy. In the early morning hours of the 30th of October, 1:13 a.m. as Jenny precisely recalled, she and Abigail were awoken by a loud thumping on the front door. It was Roger, and he looked utterly distressed. "Is Marie here?" he had asked. Jenny shook her head, saying that she wasn't, and come to think of it, neither she nor Abigail had seen her all evening. Roger told them that she had gone out for her usual run at 6 p.m, but she had not returned, and that he didn't know where she was. He had waited up until just after 11 p.m, believing she must have dropped in to see a friend on her way back, but he had fell asleep on the sofa. When he awoke again just after 1 a.m, and realised that she hadn't returned, he panicked. At length, he said that he was going to drive the roads Marie had been running, and as he wasn't sure of the exact route she would have taken, he asked Jenny if she would go along with him. Even though it was late, both she and Abigail agreed to help. It took them about an hour to reach the field where Marie previously said she had seen the objects, mostly because Roger had been driving at walking speed, calling out her name and shining his torch into the fields and hedgerows. There was no sign of her whatsoever. As it was getting on for 4 a.m, they had to abandon the search and drove back to town, hoping against hope that they would find Marie at home safe and sound. But as they pulled up on the drive, they could see that the house was still dark and empty, just as they had left it. No one was in. Although Jenny tried to reassure Roger that there was probably some perfectly reasonable explanation as to why Marie had not come home, he stayed up all night worrying, and the next day, Jenny and Abigail awoke to find a police car sitting outside their neighbour's house. Marie had still not returned, and by 8 p.m. that evening, a search was being coordinated, comprising local police and volunteers from the town. This eventually grew into a statewide search, involving hundreds of state police officers, helicopters and sniffer dogs. Signs were attached to lampposts and telephone poles in Watervale and in surrounding neighbourhoods, and local news put out bulletins asking anyone for information on Marie's whereabouts, but things remained eerily quiet. The search parties found nothing. The helicopters and sniffer dogs found nothing. And although a few calls did come in from people who thought they saw Marie, these turned out to be cases of mistaken identity. Then, on the 11th of November, police located a pair of running shoes, with the socks still inside them, sitting casually behind a hedgerow at the side of the road. They were found in such a fashion that suggested the person wearing them had simply been pulled right out of their shoes. The laces were still tied, and the socks were pushed inside them as if worn by an invisible pair of feet. Both Roger and Jenny identified them as Marie's, and were shocked to hear that they were located not too far from the field where she had first seen the strange objects. The search was formally called off on the 31st of November 2016. No trace of Marie Gillingham was ever found, and she has not been seen or heard from since. Her disappearance hit Watervale like a slap in the face. She was well known in the town and popular amongst other residents. They all said it would have been highly unusual for her to just up and leave without so much as a goodbye. All of her belongings remained at home, and still do to this day. She left for her run with only the clothes on her back and her mobile phone, which was also never found, and telephone records indicate no outgoing activity in the form of texts or calls since she vanished. Earlier attempts to triangulate her location using her phone also yielded nothing. Taking all of this into consideration, Marie just didn't have the means to run away. She didn't work and had little money of her own, and relied heavily on her husband's income. Roger himself was questioned over what kind of relationship he shared with his wife. Although they argued just like any other couple, they were still very much in love and had a strong marriage. He was ruled out as a suspect fairly early on, due to lack of any evidence or a motive suggesting he had been involved in her disappearance, and the fact that other people attested to his upstanding character and gentle nature. The general consensus in the town is that Marie was kidnapped whilst on her run, and possibly raped and murdered. And although police have not publicly stated this to be the case, it is by most accounts what they suspect. There is no evidence to suggest foul play, however. No signs of a struggle were found. No traces of blood or cadaver odours were picked up by the dogs, and there were no suspect tyre tracks suggesting a vehicle had been in the area, other than Roger's of course when he, Jenny and Abigail went to search for her. The investigation is still ongoing, and many believe that only time will tell. Jenny, on the other hand, believes differently. She believes that no matter how much time passes, Marie, or what possibly remains of her, will never be found. She has no doubt that her neighbour was abducted, but the question on her mind is not by who, But by what? She still lives in Watervale with her girlfriend. Abigail's father passed away in May 2017, and they now have no reason to stay. And yet something is keeping her there. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's that she feels duty-bound to stay and support Roger in his moment of need. Or maybe she just misses her friend. She did not realise how close she and Marie had become until after she was gone. And there is not an evening that goes by where she does not step out onto the porch before retiring to bed and looks across to her neighbour's house, hoping to see that familiar, smiling face looking back at her.